All right, so part 3 of chapter 1, the characteristics of life. Everything that is living has to have 6 specific characteristics. If you don't have all 6, then technically you are not considered a living thing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is organization. It's a condition in which the parts of an organism have specific relationships to each other, and those parts interact to perform specific functions. Now, you might say, okay, but a car has specific parts that work together to do a specific function. And while that's true, you have to remember that with a car, if I were to take, let's say, the back seat out of a car, the car would still run just fine. If I were to take, let's say, the lining out of the trunk of the car would just work fine. But for a human being, if I were to take out your heart, you would not work fine anymore. Same with if I were to take the lining of your skin off. Yeah, you wouldn't work fine anymore. So there has to be that specificity of relationship when it comes to a living thing. Second thing, metabolism. Now, I know that you're probably thinking, okay, breaking things down, because metabolism means breaking things down. But you have to remember as well that with metabolism, we're not just talking about breaking things down, we're also talking about building things. The reason that you eat the food that you eat is because you use the component parts of that food to make parts of your body, whether it's a protein or a new cell membrane, you use that. So metabolism is all chemical reactions in an organism, both breaking down things and building things. Third is responsiveness, an organism's ability to detect changes in its internal or external environments and adjust to those changes. See this little delta here? That is my shorthand for changes. So if you see a delta, it's change, just so you're aware. Okay, so if I were to go out to my car and kick the tire, would it respond in any way, shape, or form? Probably not, because it's not a living thing. Okay, it's raining and there's a thunderstorm. Who knew? By the same token, if I were to come up to you and take a swinging kick at your leg, pretty sure you'd have a reaction to that. You would respond to that in some way, shape, or form. Again, another example would be if I were to take a 10-pound bag of sugar and put it in a car. Is it going to respond in any way, shape, or form? Probably not. But if I were to make you eat a 10-pound bag of sugar, I'm pretty sure your body would have some type of response to that. 10-pound bag of sugar would probably kill you. But let's say instead of a 10-pound bag of sugar, a Snickers bar. Same thing. Your body would have a response to it because of the increase in sugar in your blood. Your body would release insulin, and that would help your cells to absorb that sugar so that it's not in your blood. There is a response to that stimulus. It isn't just, I'm going to put a candy bar into a car and nothing else is going to happen. Okay, fourth characteristic of life. Growth. An increase in the size or number of cells, resulting in overall enlargement of all or part of an organism. When your mom and dad came together and made you in love, you were one cell big. You've gotten a lot more cells since then. Okay? The day that the car was produced, it was a car. It never changed. It never got more doors or tires or anything like that. Now, development. Change as an organism undergoes through time, beginning with fertilization and ending with death. The one cell that you were created from made a ball of cells that were all exactly the same. They were all copies of each other. But at some point, those cells got specific signals. You will become a heart. You will become a liver. You will become the skin. And that's very drastically different than the day a car is produced, it's there and that's the car. That's it. It doesn't change from there. And finally, reproduction, the production of new cells or new organisms. So let's say that I go to my car and I've got a knife and I cut the car. If I come back, no work on the car, in 2 weeks, what's going to be there? A cut on the car from the knife that I dragged on its side, right? Let's say I keyed the car, right? Well, if I were to do the same thing with you, let's say that I make a 1-inch scar on your hand, in 2 weeks, or 1-inch scar, 1-inch slice on your hand, in 2 weeks, most likely that'll have healed over. So your body produces new cells to basically replace those that were damaged. New organisms. So you leave your car in the parking lot when you go to work or you go to school, right? And it's not like in 9 months you expect to see little cars, being birthed from your car. It's not a living thing. But if you have two humans, a male and a female, and they like each other, maybe even love each other, there is a possibility of them creating new organisms. So again, these are the 6 characteristics of life. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is the existence and maintenance of a relatively constant environment in the human body that is suitable to support life. A lot of times people will say that homeostasis is a set point or it's a norm. The thing you have to keep in mind, though, is you can say set point and norm, but what set point? So if I were to ask you what a normal temperature is, and you were to say 98.6 degrees, well, what about for a cat? Is it the same? No, it's not. Their set point is closer to about 101, 102. So if I put you in the situation where you've got 102 temperature, are you going to be happy? Probably not. You're probably going to feel pretty bad. So that temperature is not homeostatic because it's not suitable to support your life. You're not going to want to do anything if you feel that bad. That set point, I'm going to circle right here, is perfection. 98.6 degrees is perfect. Okay? But if I go to the gym and I start working out and my temperature goes up to 98.8, am I going to die? No. And if I go to a friend's house and it just happens to be really cold and I go down to 98.4, am I going to die? No. So there is a range where we kind of have a safe window that we can change our temperature to without keeling over and dying. So homeostasis would be that perfect set point. The range would be, it can change a little and we're not going to die. It'll be okay. So if I ask you to define homeostasis, it should be a set point suitable to support life. Notice that suitable to support life is underlined and in bold. So you need to understand that that is part of the definition. It's not just about having a set point. So how do we maintain homeostasis? Well, we kind of have 2 mechanisms. We've got something called negative feedback and we've got something called positive feedback. Negative feedback's primary function is to maintain homeostasis and decrease any deviations from the normal. So here's my window. Here's my safe window, right? And if this comes up above that window, negative feedback is going to go, no, 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 get back into your window. So that it stays within that safe window. This is the friend that when you go out drinking and you say, okay, I only want to have 2 beers. If you see me have anything else, don't let me. And you get that third beer and they go, no, 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 wait a minute. You said 2 beers. You're not getting super drunk tonight. That's negative feedback. You're not going to deviate from the norm. I'm going to put you back there. Now, positive feedback. Positive feedback is dangerous because it increases the deviation from normal. Okay? There are only really a few examples in the body, and most of them are actually harmful. And they lead the body away from homeostasis. Most of them will cause you to die. So in this case, you're going away from homeostasis and it's going, yeah, just keep going. That's great. Just keep going. Yeah. And eventually you would die. So, this is the friend who you say, I only want to have 2 beers, and they go out with you and they're like, hey, here's a shot. Hey, here's another drink. And they're taking you further and further away from normal. Positive feedback can be deadly. You have to be very careful. So, there are 3 parts to feedback systems, okay? The first is called the receptor. The second is the control center. And the third is the effector, okay? The receptor monitors or watches something and reports its findings, okay? You can kind of think of it like a baby monitor. A baby monitor doesn't change anything. All it does is it lets you listen in and hear what's going on. A receptor reports its findings. I'm looking at this, this is what's happening. I'm looking at this, this is what's happening. But it doesn't do anything about it. Just like the baby monitor doesn't pick up a baby and start cradling it because it's crying. All it does is it reports its findings. Now, let's talk control center, our second member of our feedback system. The control center evaluates incoming information and makes a choice. When something is wrong, this is what decides the action that must be taken. So, if you've got a control center that is picking up that, let's say your sugar level is too high, it might say, okay, I need to take action against this. But if the control center is getting feedback saying your sugar level is just right, it's going to say, yeah, I can ignore that for right now. It's fine. Let's go back to our baby monitor example. So let's say that the baby monitor is that you're listening to has the baby crying. And I mean like hysterical crying. Well, you're going to want to do something about that. You're going to want to go and check on the baby. You're going to want to go and see if its diaper is wet. You're going to go and see if it needs food. You have to do something in response to that. However, let's say your baby snores and you know that they snore when they're asleep and coming through the baby monitor is snoring. Do you need to do anything about that? Do you need to go and feed the baby right then? No. The baby's fine. You're the decision maker in that case. You're the control center in that case because you evaluate that information. Is it good information? Is it bad information? Do I need to do something about it? Do I not? Now, let's say that the decision is made that yes, something has to happen. The receptor picks up that you have too much sugar in your blood. The control center says, yes, okay, we have to do something about this. Most of the time, when it comes to the control center in a feedback system, that's going to be your brain. Your brain can't physically move from your head to alter anything in your blood. So it actually has to send a signal to something called our third member of this feedback system, an effector. Okay? The effector is the one that carries out the action. Now, whether this is in the case of I've got too much sugar in my blood, The control center sends a signal to the pancreas, and the pancreas releases insulin. That stops the deviation from homeostasis. It brings the sugar level down. Okay? If this were that example that I just gave you, stopping deviation from homeostasis, that example would be a negative feedback loop. That's the friend that says, no, 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 you're not having anything else to drink. However, if this were an example of a positive feedback loop, the control center makes a decision, goes to the effector, and there's an increase in the deviation from homeostasis. I'm being pushed further out from my window, then it's positive feedback. So let's go through examples with our baby monitor. Let's say that you are mom or dad and your hands are in the sink and you've got soapy hands and the baby monitor is there next to you. And you hear the baby start to cry. You can't really stop what you're doing, so you turn around and go, okay, big brother, I want you to go and I want you to take the pacifier, because you know the cry when they don't have a pacifier. So you say, I want you to go put the pacifier back in, baby's mouth. And okay, and they go and to go put the pacifier back. Well, the receptor was the baby monitor. The control center was you making the decision. They're crying. I need to do something. The effector is going to be big brother going and putting the pacifier back to stop the crying. So what started your action? The crying. Hopefully, by putting the pacifier back, that stops. Negative feedback. I go back to normal. Now, let's go with positive feedback. Same scenario. Baby is crying. You know they need a pacifier. So you make that decision. All they need is the pacifier. You send big brother into the room to put the pacifier back in the baby's mouth. And instead, big brother takes the pacifier and goes, ha ha, I have your passy and you can't have it. What's going to happen with that baby? They're probably going to lose their ever-loving mind, right? Is that normal? Just go with no for now. So that increases the deviation from homeostasis. Instead of having them calm down, you've got them now in a screaming fit because big brother won't give them their pacifier. I hope that works for you. If it doesn't, you can come in and ask me questions when we meet. So let's go with an example of negative feedback. So in my body, there is an increase in blood pressure. We have things called baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are blood pressure receptors. So they're blood pressure receptors. And they are like the baby monitor. They just report the blood pressure that they see. Here it is. Here it is. But let's say in this case, the thing that they are reporting is an increase in blood pressure. My blood pressure is going up. So the nerve impulses go to my brain. And my brain goes, oh my gosh, there's an increase in blood pressure. I need to do something about this because I'm getting out of homeostasis. So they send output to the heart and tell the heart, okay, you need to slow down. And the heart starts beating a little slower and a little softer. What's going to happen? The blood pressure is going to end up going back into the normal range and we'll be happy. This is negative feedback because what started it? High blood pressure. What finished it? Low blood pressure. Basically, I fixed it. I put it back into its window because if this was my window, here's perfection with my blood pressure window, and my blood pressure started doing this, negative feedback is going to go, no, 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 get back down into that window. Okay? So let's talk positive feedback. I'm going to give you one of the only examples I know that won't kill you. So a woman is in labor and she's experiencing contractions. When you experience contractions and the uterus contracts, it actually has the baby's head coming into contact with the cervix. That causes stretching of stretch receptors in the cervix, and they are exactly what they sound like. When you stretch them, they send signal. So the stretch receptors stretch, they send a signal to the brain, the control center, and it goes, oh my gosh, I'm in labor. I better do something about this. So it releases oxytocin. Oxytocin goes to the uterus and causes the uterus to contract, which causes the stretch receptors to stretch, which sends a signal to the brain. And the brain goes, oh my gosh, I'm in labor. I better do something about that. So the brain releases oxytocin, which goes to the uterus and causes the uterus to contract, which in turn causes the stretch receptors to stretch, which goes to the brain, and the brain goes, oh my gosh, I'm in labor. I better do something about that. And it releases oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract. Do you see how we're getting further and further away from homeostasis? Because ladies, are we normally in labor every single second of every single day? No. This is completely out of our homeostatic window. So when does it stop? What started it all? The receptors, right? The stretching of those receptors. So what do? Well, we give birth. Once the baby is born, there is nothing stretching these receptors, and it just stops. So once that stops, this feedback loop stops. Now, let me give you an example of when it'll kill you dead. So let's say that I get stabbed in the leg, okay? And I start losing blood. As my blood volume goes down, those baroreceptors we were just talking about are going to send signal to the brain. Our blood pressure is dropping. Our blood pressure is dropping. And the brain's going to go, oh no, we're losing blood pressure. I better do something about that. So what does it do? It causes the heart to contract faster and harder to try and bring up our blood pressure. If I am still bleeding, what's going to happen when my heart starts beating harder and faster? Correct. I'm going to start losing blood faster. So my blood pressure drops even more, which causes the baroreceptors to report to my brain. My brain goes, oh my gosh, my blood pressure is still dropping. I better do something about that. So it goes and sends a signal back to the heart saying, contract harder and even faster, which causes my bleeding to get even worse. See how that's going to kill me? Now, how many of you know what a tourniquet is? Tourniquets are designed basically to stop this event from happening, because if I can prevent my body from losing blood, I don't go down that positive feedback loop because I'm not losing any more volume than what I've already lost. So let's talk terminology and the body plan. Anatomical position is somebody facing forward. Okay, they're facing you. Their arms are out to their sides, right next to their body, and their palms are facing forward. Feet about shoulder width apart. Kind of like these guys, except their feet are right next to each other. But this would be anatomical position if their feet were slightly parted right under their shoulders. Okay, so that is anatomical position. It's important that you understand what anatomical position is, because push comes to shove, if you've got a patient in some weird position, you imagine they're in anatomical position to direct the doctor where they need to look, okay? Supine means lying face up. Prone means lying face down. Most of the time when I hear these two terms used, it's usually when they're describing how a body was found in like one of the CSI shows or one of the murder mystery shows. The victim was found in a supine position. They'll talk like that, or they'll say supine. I say supine because that was how I learned it. Now let's talk directional terms, body parts and regions, planes, body cavities, and serous membranes. So, directional terms always come with an opposite. If there's an up, there's a down. If there's a left, there's a right. If there's an in, there's an out. So they always come in pairs. So let's talk about the first pair, medial and lateral. Medial means toward the middle. Lateral means toward the side. So if I were to say in this example here, the heart is blank to the lungs, is the heart toward the middle compared to the lungs, or is it toward the side compared to the lungs? It's toward the middle. So you would say the heart is medial to the lungs. Using the same example, using the heart and the lungs, if I were to say the lungs are blank to the heart, well, in this case, are they toward the side or are they toward the middle? They're toward the sides, right? So that would be lateral. The lungs are lateral to the heart because they're toward the sides, they're not going toward the middle. So that's the first example. Now, anterior and posterior. Anterior means toward the front. And if I could write, that would be better. Toward the front. Posterior means toward the back. Two terms that you will hear kind of used interchangeably with this are ventral and dorsal. But on a human, ventral and dorsal would mean toward the front and toward the back. A lot of times, though, when you're describing animals, you tend to use ventral and dorsal more because it actually fits better. So let's say I've got a cat, right? If we say toward the back, well, the back is now up here. The front is down here. It's not the same type of positioning as something that is on two legs. So we tend to use ventral down here and dorsal up here. And if you can't remember that, think of a shark and its dorsal fin. I know that's a sad shark. Just go with me on it, though. Pretend like I'm an artist. That dorsal fin is along the shark's back. So ventral would be along its front. So looking at the example, the triangle is blank to the circle. Is it anterior toward the front or is it posterior toward the back? It's anterior, right? The triangle is anterior to the circle because it's in front of it. So I would say this is anterior. Now you can also say it's ventral if you want. Like I said, they're kind of interchangeable terms. Personally, I like anterior and posterior for two-footed people. I only really use ventral and dorsal if I'm talking about a four-legged creature. But you will see, because science has to be complicated, that they interchange in some texts. So what about the circle? The circle is blank to the triangle. Is it in front of it or is it behind it? It's behind it, right? So that would be posterior. Now, I will admit that when I was learning this, for me, this was complicated. This was very complicated. And I used to say in front of or behind and then just fill in the proper word because that was just the way my brain worked. The joys of having ADHD. And again, for posterior, you can also use dorsal. So another set of terms, superior and inferior. Superior is on top of, inferior is below. Now let's go back to our cat example. If something is toward the head, we would say it was superior, right? But if something's toward the feet, we would say inferior. Yeah, that doesn't work real well for four-legged animals or animals that are in that position. So instead, we use the interchangeable terms, cephalic and caudal. Okay, cephalic, cephalo, means head. Caudal means tail. So in the case of the cat, again, not an artist. If it goes this way, it would be cephalic. If it goes this way, it would be caudal. And for us, you can say that it's going toward our tailbone, because you know where your tailbone is. So in this example, the head is blank to the stomach. Is it above it or is it below it? Remember, superior means above, inferior means below. So the head is blank to the stomach. It's superior. Okay? And again, with an animal, if I were to say the head is what to the stomach, it would just be cephalic. The head is closer to the head than it is to the stomach. Now, the stomach is blank to the head. Is it above it or below it? If you say below, then this is the term that you use. You use inferior. So the stomach is inferior to the head. Same here. Again, it's not necessarily up and down because of the orientation of the animal, but instead of using inferior, you would use caudal. It's toward the tail. Compared to the head, the stomach is closer to the tail. It goes in that direction. And let me erase all this because I didn't realize I'd clicked when I was using it. Proximal and distal. Proximal and distal have to do with your limbs. Okay? So here's your torso. I know it's a very long torso. Just go with me on it. It deals with how far away these limbs or these parts of these limbs are from that torso. And literally, it's only the limbs that we're talking about. You will never hear these used to describe the head or the organs in the center of your body, your heart, your lungs, never. So in this case, I'm going to go with the hand versus the elbow. Okay? So hang on. Proximal means closer to. Distal means distant. Big surprise, I know. So in this case, the elbow is blank to the hand. Is it closer to the torso or further away from the torso? Is it distant? It's closer to the torso, this part of the body, right? So the elbow is proximal to the hand. Okay? Sorry, torso. In this example, we're talking about the thigh versus the ankle, right? So if I were to say the ankle is blank to the thigh. Again, we're talking about a limb. So is the ankle distant or is it closer to the torso? It's distant, so we would say it's distal. Now, superficial and deep. Usually we're talking about wounds, and I'm sure if anybody has ever seen any type of action movie, you've seen an action movie where they say, oh, it's just a superficial wound. Superficial means it is on the surface. Okay? Deep, I can't get it right, okay, means below the surface. Okay? So in a deep wound, we're talking about going into the tissues. If it's a superficial wound, then it's just on the surface. A mosquito bite that's bleeding would be a superficial wound. A stab wound that also nicks your liver would be considered a deep wound. Now, don't freak out. I know you want to, don't freak out. These are the body parts. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that. That's not what I'm asking you to do. What I am going to ask you to do, though, is to make sure to take a look at it. Primary reason being, some of these terms are going to come up later. And when they do come up later, knowing what the terms mean as far as position on the body will help you. There are axillary veins and axillary arteries. If you know axillary means armpit, you're going to know exactly where to look. There are brachial arteries. That's actually how they take your blood pressure with that blood pressure cuff. That means arm. It's the upper portion of your arm. Okay? If you get familiar with this terminology, ultimately it will help you. So try and just go through it and get to the point where if you hear these terms, you know where on the body I'm talking about. If I say inguinal, you'll know that I'm talking about the groin area. If I say axillary, you're going to know I'm talking about the armpit. These terms are beneficial to understand. So, quadrants and regions. So, quadrants basically takes the abdomen and it divides it into 4. Very simply, there's a right upper quadrant, a left upper quadrant, a right lower quadrant, and a left lower quadrant. You might go, okay, why do I need to know that? Again, if you're a nurse or you're a paramedic or you're a doctor and you need to explain where you found a wound, it's very easy to go, I found it in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen. So they know exactly where to look and they're not looking in other places for other wounds that aren't there or that you've already found. 9 regions. So this is like a tic-tac-toe. Okay? The right hypochondriac region. Now, something else to keep in mind, right and left when it comes to anatomy and physiology, it's going to always be the patient's right and left. It's not yours. So you always have to do the mirror image. So looking at your screen, this is the right side of the patient. It isn't your right. Okay? So the regions, there are 9 of them. You've got the right hypochondriac region. Hypo means below. Chondro in A&P refers to cartilage. Okay? You know how on your rib cage you've got cartilage down here? This is why they call this the right hypochondriac region, because it's right below that cartilage. The other side over here is the left hypochondriac region. Why? Because it's the same thing. It's right beneath the cartilage. The middle here is called the epigastric region. So epi means above. And in A&P, when you hear gastro, that's the stomach. So epigastric, it's right above the stomach. Here's your stomach. Okay? Now, the next row. You've got the right lumbar region and the left lumbar region on the outside. Your vertebra, the spinal column, the biggest vertebra that you have are right at your waist. Okay, they bear the most weight. They're actually the most girthy of those vertebra. That's why we call them the lumbar regions. Dead center, we've got the umbilical region. What do you think is there? Correct, it's a belly button. Now, the right and left iliac region on this third row. So I'm sure you've seen a pelvis, right? This big old butterfly wing here on the pelvis is actually called the ilium. Okay? So calling it the iliac region is literally because you've got that bone making a bowl that this sits in. So you've got the right iliac region and the left iliac region. Then dead center in the middle on this last row, you've got the hypogastric region. Now we know hypo means below, so this is below the stomach. The planes. So you can divide the body into different planes. If you look here, this piece of glass right here, this is the sagittal plane. In the picture, it's actually the mid-sagittal plane because it's directly in the center of his face. Imagine that there's a piece of glass in the ceiling and it falls and it cuts me into right and left halves. If it were, let's say, missed my head but hit my shoulder and basically cut my arm, part of my torso, and part of my leg away from my body, that would still be considered sagittal plane. It would still divide me into left and right halves. Unequal, but still it would be there. The coronal plane, which is this one down here, okay, this dude here. Let's say that there's a big, huge plate of glass in the ceiling and it falls and it cuts me into front and back halves. The coronal plane can also be called the frontal plane. So I always think for the word coronal of a crown, like a queen's crown. If you think about when you were little and you would go to, if you're a girl, most likely, if you were to go to H-E-B and your mom said you can pick one thing and you always got the princess kit because it had a tiara. Well, the tiara was only really a headband with some stones on it. So think of that headband. What does a headband do? It cuts your head into front and back halves. So coronal plane. Now the transverse plane. Transverse plane cuts you into top and bottom halves. So pane of glass on the desk and I take a running jump at it, I'm going to get cut into top and bottom pieces. You can also call the transverse plane the horizontal plane. Now, if we're talking about the sections of organs, let's say that we're doing slides, for example, you've got three other terms that you can use, okay? Longitudinal, cross-section, and oblique. So if this is the intestine, this example here, longitudinal would mean that you're cutting along the long edge. So imagine I've got a straw in front of you, standing up and down. I cut it from up to down. So it's the long piece. Cross-sectional, okay, means that I go across. Okay. I make lifesavers out of the intestine. You can also call this transverse. Okay. Most of the time when I'm ordering slides for the lab, I look for longitudinal and I look for cross-sectional cuts. Anything else that isn't directly on the X plane or directly on the Y plane is going to be something called oblique. It's any angle that isn't either flat or straight up and down. And to be honest, most of the time you don't like those. If you're working in the lab and you're trying to get really nice slides for your students, oblique slides you usually send back. So, body cavities. We've got two main cavities, the dorsal cavity, and up here is the ventral cavity. Ventral. Okay, so the purple and pink, that's the ventral body cavity, which you can see there. The dorsal cavity is pretty simple. It only has kind of two subcategories, the cranial cavity, where your brain sits, and the vertebral canal, which is where your spinal cord sits. When it comes to your ventral body cavity, it gets a little bit more complicated. So, you've got the purple, right? You can see that. That is together the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic cavity. I just completely messed that up, didn't I? Ugh. Sorry, guys. Rewinding. The top above the diaphragm. This is the thoracic cavity. The combo of the pink and the purple below your diaphragm. This is your diaphragm right here. This is the abdominopelvic cavity. It would also help if I could spell pelvic cavity. Your abdominal cavity is just this cavity right here. And honestly, it holds most of your organs. It holds your stomach, it holds most of your intestines, it holds your liver, it holds your gallbladder. So the abdominopelvic cavity holds quite a bit. Or I'm sorry, the abdominal cavity. The pelvic cavity, this little dude right here, it's basically the bowl created by your pelvis. This is going to be where your bladder is or any internal reproductive organs. So for females, this would also be where the uterus and the ovaries and the fallopian tubes are. Yeah. Now, I'm going to erase all this so I can start working on the top here. The thoracic cavity. Thoracic cavity actually has several cavities within it. This right here, this little kind of weird square, is called the mediastinum. The mediastinum holds part of the esophagus, part of the trachea, the thyroid, sorry. It's above the heart. The heart is also surrounded by a cavity. This is called the pericardial cavity. P-E-R-I. Peri means around. What's cardio? The heart. So the pericardial cavity is the sac surrounding the heart. How many lungs do you have? 2, right? 1, 2. We have cavities surrounding those 2. They both have the same name. They're called the pleural cavities. So plural, think of more than one because you have two lungs. Okay, so those are the body cavities. Every organ in your body is covered by a membrane. It has to be because, think about it, every time that you move your torso around, your organs rub against each other. If I didn't have anything protective surrounding it, it would basically rub itself raw. I mean, I can sit here and I can rub my hands together, but imagine me doing that for like 12 hours. Eventually, I would rub my hands raw. So let's say instead of doing that, I put a pair of gloves on, let's say a pair of latex gloves. I dip my hands in Vaseline and then I do the rubbing. If I do that and keep replacing that Vaseline, my hands, my actual hands, the skin on my hands will not be damaged. So we kind of have the same thing when it comes to our organs. We have the equivalent of the latex gloves covering our hand, and then the cavity that the hand sits in. So if you look here, you'll notice that around the heart, I have this kind of blue outline, and then there's a space, and then literally right on top of the heart, I've got a red outline. Same with the lungs. You can see right on top of the lungs, I've got a red, then there's that white space, and then I've got this blue out here. These are the membranes. And the one that lines the walls, okay, the one that's blue, is considered the parietal serous membrane. It's the one that covers the cavity, not the organ. The red lining that you see around the lungs here is the visceral serous membrane. Visceral, whenever you hear that word, think internal. So the visceral membrane is going to be covering the organ. Then there's that white space that I pointed out earlier. That white space normally is literally a space, kind of like what you see up here in the balloon example, between the outer membrane and the inner membrane. Now, normally there is going to be fluid in there. So there's going to be a lubricant in there, kind of like the Vaseline on my hands and my rubbing them together. Why? Because you don't want them rubbing the membranes raw either. I mean, think about rubber gloves and rubbing those rubber gloves together without anything in between them. That probably wouldn't feel good. There's actually a disease called pleurisy. Pleurisy happens when that membrane between your lung and the cavity that your lung is sitting in, that space doesn't have enough fluid in it. So as you're breathing, you're literally just rubbing it, and eventually it gets very, very painful to breathe. That friction that's created causes inflammation and it causes pain. And unfortunately, you go to the doctor and you go, it hurts when I breathe, and they figure out it's pleurisy, and they'll go, yeah, so take some Advil, I'll see you in 3 weeks, because there's no way to replace that fluid. It's just something that your body has to get through. And that is the end of chapter 1.